Boss fights are one of the most integral parts of a player's experience in Guild Wars 2. They mark some of the most epic moments in the game. They are a barrier to one's progression while also being a capstone of a journey. Boss fights can be seen everywhere in Guild Wars 2, in jumping puzzles, in meta events, in raids and fractals, and in so many other places as well. Today, I wanted to celebrate the bosses of Guild Wars 2 and go through my list of what I think the 10 best bosses in the entirety of the game is. So let's get started. Starting off, I want to look at the Twisted Marionette. This giant watchwork super weapon was a creation of Scarlet Briar and served as a road boss in Lornar's Pass during Living World Season 1. This boss released alongside the Triple Trouble road boss, which made this release one of the most iconic of the season. One of the most important parts of the Marionette is how it is the first major example of a multi-lane boss, where the entire map has to divide into multiple groups in order to fight the boss. In this case, 5 groups. We see the style boss in the open world occur again and again throughout the course of Guild Wars 2, such as with the Vinewrath or the Octovine. I remember back during Season 1 that this boss was incredibly difficult for the player base at the time. It was one of the first major events that required players to have to organize a large group of people because a lot of the vanilla world bosses were relatively simple in what players had to do. But unfortunately, like much of Season 1, this boss went away after its initial release. But fortunately, it did return in 2021, allowing players to experience the boss again. While the fight is much easier nowadays, it is still relatively challenging in that it requires players to organize themselves between each of the 5 lanes, and that each player in each lane needs to know how to fight their version of the boss. However, while it is pretty rewarding because of how you access it and how squads do fail it, you normally only see this boss die once a day at reset, at least in NA. But nevertheless, probably one of the most important bosses in Guild Wars 2's history. And coming in at number 9 is Qadim. Qadim is a very special boss because he serves as the final boss of not one but 2 raid wings, where he is the primary antagonist of both the Mithrite Gambit and the Key of Adashim raids. In addition to that, the Wing 6 version of Qadim is generally considered the single most difficult boss out of all the bosses in the 7 wings, while the Wing 7 boss, who's not as difficult, is still very challenging. Qadim is also one of the oldest enemies that we fight in the entire game, other than the Elder Dragons, where presumably he has been around Tyria for thousands of years. And the Jinn themselves are incredibly cool, and the story being told between these 2 raid wings is fascinating. While Qadim is not the best written villain in the world, or even the game, his story itself is still cool and helps support the stories being told about Zomros and the Jinn as a whole. And at number 8, let us return to the open world, and let us actually return to Season 1 because I have the epic world boss of Triple Trouble in this slot. I mentioned that Triple Trouble released alongside the Twisted Marionette, and out of these 2 bosses in the release, this one is my favorite. In the seaside zone of Bloodtide Coast resides this epic road boss that requires the entire map to split into 3 groups to each combat one head of a giant worm. This fight is one of the hardest open world events in the game and requires a massive amount of coordination, even today. The fight itself is incredibly fun, and each worm requires the group to do an incredibly different mechanic in order to beat the boss. The Amber Worm is my favorite because it requires you to get eaten by the worm, and then you fight your way out of its stomach. One of the most epic parts of this fight is how there are 2 parts. When one of the worms is decapitated, the other 2 also have to die within 1 minute, or the event will not move on to the second part. If all 3 worms are decapitated within 1 minute after the first one, then the fight will move on to the second phase, where all 3 decapitated worm heads will begin fighting the group, and everyone will have to kill all 3 heads in 2 minutes in order to finish the full fight successfully. Back when this originally released, it was incredibly difficult. It took a long time for squads across the world to tackle this boss for the first time, where when the first squad, who was on the Desolation server back when servers were still relevant, had one of their commanders give an epic speech, which was immortalized in a plaque here in-game. Coming in at number 7 is the Mouth of Mordremoth. Mordremoth is the second Elder Dragon that we fight in the game and is the primary antagonist of the Heart of Thorns expansion. While the story part of the fight where you go into his mind and fight him there is a little controversial, where I like it quite a bit but many others do not, the open world version is considered one of the coolest boss fights in the game. The map of Dragonstand is an epic battlefield that begins with all the packed forces concentrated in a singular camp on the eastern side of the map. All the players have to organize themselves between 3 lanes to simultaneously push down all the lanes against the forces of Mordremoth, complete events, and fight bosses along the way. But once all 3 lanes are able to push the Mordrem all the way back, the entire map converges to fight the Mouth of Mordremoth. There are 9 floating platforms that the squad spreads to defend, fight Mordremoth, and even have the opportunity to fight the mouth. Periodically, the mouth will attempt to eat a platform to consume the ley energy, while also reducing the amount of space that players have to work with. Back when Heart of Thorns originally released, this fight was relatively difficult compared to nowadays, where it is pretty easy, but both back then and today, the fight is very, very cool. At number 6 is one of the most iconic villains in the entire series, Palawa Joko, commonly referred to as King Joko the Inevitable, the last primeval king, Joko the Undying, the Scourge of Abbey, Joko the Feared, Joko the Beloved, Joko the Transcendent, and Joko the Eternal Monarch of all. Palawa Joko was an important character in the original Guild Wars during the Nightfall campaign and plays an integral role in Guild Wars 2's Path of Fire expansion and the subsequent Living World Season 4. Joko is one of the most beloved characters in the entire game. He checks all the boxes, he has an incredible model, he is a convincing villain, he has incredible dialogue, and he's involved in an incredible story. The only part about him that doesn't have him closer to the number 1 spot is how the final fight against him isn't the greatest thing in the game. The fight is relatively mediocre, it's not horrible, it's just not the most fun fight in the game for me. The lead up is pretty cool where you are being taunted by Joko while processing how twisted of an individual he really is. Although many people consider the fortress you are fighting through, Gandhara, to have been wasted in this release. Once you get up to Joko's room, as I said, the fight is okay, just not the best. But once you defeat Joko, the final cinematic is one of my favorite moments in the entire game, and it finishes with this iconic moment.
Surely, no mortal would be so monumentally stupid as to destroy a dragon. The life force of this world. Let alone 2. And a god to boot. Perhaps they will finally thank me for luring you to me. So that I may save the world from you. And once you're gone, everyone will flock to my embrace. They will all love me, Palawa, Ignatius,
At number 5 is Balthazar. The god of fire and war serves as the primary antagonist in the Path of Fire expansion. This boss is special because you fight him at 3 different points in the expansion story. Each time you fight him is relatively unique. While there are similar themes in his attacks between each fight, the experiences throughout the fight are different. In addition to that, each fight has a different impact on the story. Where the first time you face Balthazar, it is your first bout with him and you're trying to stop him from killing Vlast. Also, I just want to point out that how he leaps up here is so cool looking. The second time you fight him, he wins and kills you, where you then start the whole story step in the Domain of the Lost. Then finally, you fight him again at the end of the Path of Fire story. It is a huge battle where first you have to fight your way through the Kodash Bazaar, then you fight the War Beast, and then you fight Balthazar. The final arena is so cool because you are fighting Balthazar on the ground, and you have the statues of Palawa Joko watching you from one side, and then the Elder Dragon Kralkatorrik watching you from the other. Everything just comes together in a beautiful way, and the final fight itself is really fun. The dialogue is incredible, the scenery is beautiful, the stakes are high, and Balthazar is just an altogether, well put together villain.
You cannot win! The gods have abandoned this world! Abandoned you!
No! They abandoned you!
I am fire! I am war! What are you?
Still standing!
And for number 4, I have Soo-Won.
Look. The world is ending. A landscape of shattered dreams and death. And all due to me.
The final Elder Dragon that we fight in Guild Wars 2's story in order to end the dragon cycle. Soo-Won is special because the boss fight is technically 3 completely unique boss fights all in one. One in the open world as a massive meta event, one in the story as an incredibly emotional moment, and one in the strike missions as the hardest fight in the game so far. And all 3 are really good. Let's take a brief look at each of these. With the open world, we see an epic meta event that covers the entire map of Dragon's Inn that brings together the various factions of Cantha, as well as some people from mainland Terry as well, in order to fight the boss. This meta is considered one of the hardest in the game, where it requires a good amount of team coordination for a squad of players to beat the meta. While a lot of open world content allows people to coast through it with relative ease, this meta, while not being exceptionally difficult in the grand scheme of things, does require every player to put in some more effort into what they are doing during the meta. Because of that, it is not always a guaranteed victory every time this meta is done, and thus the entire map rallies together and works together. While the map meta is us basically subduing Soo-Won's corruption, the story has us killing her in order to save Tyria.
The cycle ends.
We are truly awake.
The Ender Dragon story is honestly really sad because of how Soo-Won is the final boss of the expansion, but is also a good character. As we play through the story, we learn more about the Dragon Void and the Dragon Cycle, and in a last-ditch effort to save the entire world from the Void, bring all of our forces together to fight Soo-Won. The final fight itself is pretty easy, but is very fun because Aurene shares her power with us as we become a true champion of an Elder Dragon in order to defeat the Void. Whereas we work our way up the Harvest Temple, we essentially go through the entire story of Guild Wars 2 up to this point, where we relive a more simplistic version of each previous Elder Dragon fight, all the way up to the end until we have our final moment of striking down the Void and our final moment with Soo-Won.
I'm going to dream now.
But beyond the open world meta and the story versions of this fight, we have the strike mission version, which is canonically a vision of a would-be version of the fight, and mechanically serves as a difficult piece of 10-player content. With the Soo-Won strike, we have a normal mode and a challenge mode version of the fight. The normal mode fight is incredibly fun and shares some similar vibes to the story mode version of the fight. It's a relatively difficult, but not too exceptionally difficult in that most players can beat the fight, especially after a few attempts to learn it. But when we look at the challenge mode version of the fight, everything goes from 0 to 100 instantly, where the strike scheme is generally considered the single most difficult piece of content in the entire game, where any group of inexperienced players should expect hours of progression in order to beat the fight. When the fight was originally released, it took 6 days for the boss to die for the first time. 6 days. And some of that difficulty can be attributed to a couple of bugs that made the fight even more difficult, but looking at the fight without the bugs shows just how insane this fight is and how much coordination, game sense, and skill is required by players in order to beat the fight for the first time. And now at number 3 is another Elder Dragon and the last one on this list, Kralkatorrik. Kralkatorrik is one of the most important characters in the Path of Fire expansion and serves as the final boss of Living World Season 4. Similar to other bosses on this list, there are multiple versions of the Kralkatorrik fight that we can look at. The first being in episode 5 of the season, where we rally all the different factions that we have befriended during the season and beforehand together in Thunderhead Peaks, lure Kralkatorrik into the keep and trap him there while launching a full-on offensive against him. But we see this plan eventually fails as Kralkatorrik wins the fight, kills a lot of people, and even temporarily kills Aurene. Where when this episode first released, the community didn't know if Aurene was going to be coming back or not, and it was a relatively bleak moment. And in the next episode, Aurene does revive herself, and we have another fight against him, where we are riding Aurene through the mists, traveling through the different realms of the gods, and attacking Kralkatorrik atop our beloved dragon friend until we eventually force Kralkatorrik out of the mists as he falls to Tyria and creates a whole new map with his entire body trapped under various parts of the realms of the gods he had been destroying. The map itself serves as a meta event against Kralkatorrik, where at the end of it we are scaling his back and trying to cause even more damage to him. Where finally in the last story mission of the season, we travel underneath the map in order to disrupt the ley lines that Kralkatorrik is feeding off of that is preventing his death. But by doing so, we learn that something inside of Kralkatorrik is keeping him alive even though his body itself is dead. Where the Aurene takes us atop her back once again as we fly through the mouth of Kralkatorrik and discover this incredibly beautiful and epic area with Kralkatorrik's heart inside. Here, we learn a lot about the Elder Dragons and how Kralkatorrik has been tormented for millennia. That he is not inherently evil, but has been tormented and driven to madness. As such, Aurene and us work together to defeat Kralkatorrik's torment, which has us going on a journey similar to the Soo-Won fight, where we re-experience the Balthazar fight, the Mordremoth fight, and the Zaitan fight all over again in a more simplistic version, until we finally free Kralkatorrik of his torment, and in doing so we have an absolutely beautiful cutscene as Aurene obtains the magics found within Kralkatorrik, and ascends into the Elder Dragon of Crystal and Light.
My grandfather's prophecy is fulfilled. My mother's legacy is complete. I can't explain what's about to happen, champion. But I want to share it with you. All of you.
Overall, Kralkatorrik is just an incredibly cool boss, with each version of the fight being fun and just awesome. The story is incredible and a beautiful capstone to Season 4. A lot of people hope that Kralkatorrik would be the final Elder Dragon we fought because of the story of Destiny's Edge, and while that was not the case, it was still beautifully done.
She is the first of her kind.
And in the number 2 slot, we have the Voice in the Void, the Emperor of Oblivion, Death Undeniable, Dhuum, the final boss of the 5th Raid Wing Hall of Chains.
Mortals, you believe yourselves saviors. Naturally, you seek to write the conclusion of your legend. There is no conclusion more natural than death.
Dhuum is just incredible. I recently made an entire story detailing the history of the underworld, the human god Grinth, Desmina, and Dhuum, and doing that made me love Dhuum even more than before. Dhuum was a boss during the original Guild Wars and one of the most difficult pieces of content in the original game, and is a boss in the sequel and one of the most difficult pieces of content in this game. The Dhuum fight itself is incredibly fun. It's not the most difficult fight in the game, as it mostly just emphasizes knowledge and practice more than skill, but it's still definitely very difficult. The challenge mode version of the fight is definitely much harder than the normal mode version, and is definitely one of the hardest fights in the entire game. But the reason Dhuum is so high on this list is just the vibes of his design and how cool of a character he is. Dhuum was originally the god of death and ruler of the underworld before being usurped by Grinth. Since then, he has been imprisoned by Grinth, only gaining freedom a couple of times after having gained power. The most recent iteration of the Dhuum fight appears to be the last, as his story ends and the underworld story moves on to other characters. The build up to the final boss, the lore, the voice acting, the environment, the final cutscene, and just everything related to Dhuum just pushes Dhuum to be an incredible boss and one of the most beloved in the entire game.
I see a light!
Submit, flee, no matter. Your life is mine. Surrender in body and spirit.
And now at number 1, the boss who I think is the coolest villain in the entire game, whose fight is incredibly fun, whose story is incredibly well written, and whose design is just incredible, is Deimos. The final boss of the 4th raid wing, Bastion of the Penitent. The wing itself is a very good wing with a very good story inside of it. Deimos is tormenting Saw D'Alessio, the founder of the White Mantle, and is feasting on his fear and his suffering.
I was desperate and turned to thievery to pay my creditors. But I could not outrun my guilt. I was caught for my crimes and exiled. I was left for dead until the Mersat found me.
As you reach the final boss in the raid, you see this old, ragged man locked within a pillory. As you help free the man, Deimos enters the arena, and you discover that this man is Saw D'Alessio.
I gambled away everything I had, and then some. But they came to collect on my debts.
Saw D'Alessio's story is just incredible, and the story of the Bastion of the Penitent is equally incredible, and a beautiful ending to his story as well.
I was a slave to the bottle. I lost everyone I'd held dear.
I think Saw's story is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, in the entire game. When we look at the fight itself, it is a really good fight as well. It's not the hardest boss in the entire game, but it is definitely up there. There are a lot of unique mechanics that you have to handle, which requires players to play very specific roles. The dialogue during the fight as Saw explains his past adds so much to the fight, and the area surrounding the arena is absolutely beautiful. Deimos' design itself is also absolutely incredible. He just looks so cool. His model is insane, and I am a big fan of demons in video games, and I love how both the original Guild Wars as well as Guild Wars 2 has handled demons, with Deimos being one of the most prominent of the demons that we see in the game so far. With everything together, the boss design, the incredible story, the fun mechanics, Deimos is my favorite boss in Guild Wars 2.
The Mersat betrayed us and murdered my men, and then dragged me to this terrible place. I've been trapped here, tormented by my own demons, paralyzed by the shame of selling out my people. The Eye kept me alive, and used my guilt to try to break me down, force me to be the Mersat's puppet. Now, I'm free.
This list is obviously very subjective, and while I did look at many factors beyond my own experience when I was making this list, it is ultimately just my opinion. I put some special mentions down in the description, but if you think a different boss should have made this list, please let me know down in the comments. Subscribe to let me know if you want more Guild Wars 2 top 10 lists in the future, and have a good one everyone.